Salam, Episode 13, Part 16. In the last part, we learned something that already felt impossible to say without falling into old habits. Phi is before time and before space as we usually imagine them. Not inside time, not inside space. Those are later readings of variation, not containers that exist first. And if that was disorienting, Part 16 is more intimate. Because it touches the place where people stop arguing like scientists and start arguing like wounded poets. Mind, matter, consciousness, the inside and the outside, the thought and the rock, the dream and the door handle. We live with a split that feels undeniable. On one side, things that appear public, stable, hard, shareable. On the other side, thoughts, feelings, images, pain, meaning, memory. Private, soft, vanishing, unshareable in the same way. For centuries, we have tried to settle the dispute by choosing a winner. Some say the physical is fundamental and the mental is a byproduct, a foam on the sea of matter. Some say the mental is fundamental and the physical is a picture drawn inside mind. Some say they are two substances, mind stuff and matter stuff. And then they spend the rest of their lives trying to explain how two different substances can ever touch. HOLOPHASE refuses that entire courtroom. Not because it is lazy, because it is disciplined. HOLOPHASE says, before you split reality into mind and matter, you must earn the permission to split anything at all. You must have comparability. You must have a way for this to be different from that. You must have a primitive that makes distinction possible before any category can be meaningful. That primitive is phi. And so part 16 carries a claim that can sound strange at first, but becomes simple once you stop demanding that the universe speak your inherited language. The core claim is this: phi is neither mental nor physical. Phi comes before the mind-matter distinction. Mind and matter are two kinds of patterns in the same primitive, two kinds of stabilized readability that differ in persistence, accessibility, and licensing, not in substance. Let me say it again in simpler words. Reality is not built from two different stuffs. It is built from one primitive capacity to make differences readable. Mind and matter are names we give to two different families of readable pattern. They feel different because they behave differently, not because they come from different roots. Now, why does this matter? Because if you don't get this permission right, you will keep asking a question that is shaped like a trap. How does matter produce mind? That question already assumes matter is the primitive and mind is the mystery. Or, how does mind produce matter? That assumes mind is the primitive and matter is the mystery. Or, how do two substances interact? That assumes the split is fundamental and interaction is the mystery. But if phi is the primitive, then the split itself is not the foundation. It is a later specialization. And the hard problem is not how can one substance generate the other, but how can one primitive generate two different modes of readability, one that becomes public and persistent, and one that becomes private and self-referential. Even that is still too advanced for where we stand right now, because we are still in undifferentiated phi. We haven't built the public layer yet. We haven't built the full licensing machinery yet. We are earning the right to talk that way later. So part 16 is not claiming to solve neuroscience today. It is earning the permission to stop making the wrong metaphysical assumptions before neuroscience even begins. To feel this, we start with the simplest experience that almost everyone has, and almost everyone forgets to take seriously. A dream. You wake up and the dream is still on you, like perfume. In the dream, you were walking through a city you've never visited. You saw faces, you felt fear, you felt relief. You touched the wall and it felt rough. You heard a voice say your name. You turned, and then you wake. Now you are in your room. The pillow is there. The air is colder than in the dream. The phone screen lights up. You can drink water. You can walk to the kitchen. You can tell someone you had a dream, but you cannot hand them the dream the way you can hand them the glass. So we say, the dream was mental. The room is physical. But notice what is hidden in that habit. Both the dream and the room were experienced. Both appeared as structured differences. Both were readable. In the dream, there was a difference between the wall and the floor, between the voice and the silence, between fear and relief. In the room, there is a difference between the pillow and the sheet, between light and shadow, between inside and outside. The dream did not fail because it lacked physical substance. It failed, if you want to use that word, because it lacked certain kinds of persistence and public agreement. It did not stay put when you turned away. It did not remain accessible when you changed state. It could not be independently checked by another person in the same way. Those are differences of stability and licensing, not differences of primitive root. In holophase language, we say both are patterns. The difference is in how the patterns are stabilized, shared, and certified. And this is already a relief, if you let it be, because it dissolves a cruelty we commit in everyday life. When someone is suffering, we often say, it's just in your head, as if that means it is less real. But your headache is a pattern. Your grief is a pattern. Your anxiety is a pattern. Your joy is a pattern. Their reality is not measured by whether another person can see them directly. Their reality is measured by whether they have structure, whether they make differences in experience, whether they constrain behavior, whether they persist, whether they can be predicted, whether they can be changed. Those are questions of pattern, not questions of mythical substance. Now let's deepen the intuition with something that lives exactly on the seam between mind and matter. Skill. Watch a master craftsperson. Not in a romantic way. In the literal way you watch hands. In a textile workshop, a master weaver sits at the loom. Thread runs like a small river through her fingers. The carpet is not yet there, and yet in some sense it is already there, because she is already seeing the structure that will appear. Her hands move, her eyes glance, not only at what is present, but at what must be consistent with what will be present. A child asks her, is the pattern in your mind, or is it in the thread? And the honest answer is, the question is too blunt. The pattern is not a ghost floating above the thread. The pattern is not merely the thread either. The pattern is a relationship among differences that can be carried by many mediums. Intention, memory, muscle, knot, color, tension, rhythm. When the weaver imagines the next row, that imagination is already a structured difference. It distinguishes this move from that move, red here from blue here. That structure is not nothing. It is not an illusion. It is a pattern. When her hand ties the knot, that structure is now carried in wool. Still a pattern. When the child learns by watching, the structure is now carried in the child's nervous system. Still a pattern. And when the finished carpet hangs on a wall years later, the structure is carried in the arrangement of dyed fibers. Still a pattern. Same pattern family, different carriers, different persistence, different accessibility. This is exactly what part 16 is pointing at. Mind is not a separate substance. Matter is not a separate substance. There are different regimes of pattern carriage and pattern stability inside a single primitive that makes pattern possible at all. You can see this even more cleanly with music, because music is the art of pattern moving through mediums. A composer feels a longing. That longing is not a number, but it has structure. It has direction, tension, release, memory of what was, expectation of what might come. That is already pattern. She writes notes on paper. Now the pattern is ink. The longing has not disappeared. It has changed carrier. A pianist plays the notes. Now the pattern is air pressure waves. The longing has not disappeared. It has changed carrier. A listener hears, and tears appear. Now the pattern is again living inside the nervous system, inside a private interior. The longing has not disappeared. It has changed carrier. Where did the longing really exist? In the mind? In the paper? In the air? The right answer is, it existed as a pattern that could be carried across many forms, and mind and matter are just names we give to some of those forms. HOLOPHASE simply gives a disciplined root for that insight. Phi is the primitive capacity for such patterning to be possible, and before the split, phi is not yet mental or physical. Those labels belong to later stabilized readings. Now we have to say what we are not saying, because this is where people misunderstand and either panic or over-celebrate. We are not saying everything is mind. We are not saying everything is matter. We are not saying everything is conscious. We are not smuggling consciousness into the primitive. We are saying something more careful and frankly more respectful to both science and experience. The mind-matter split is not a primitive fact. It is a derived classification that emerges when patterns become stabilized and licensed in different ways. Phi precedes that classification. So the proper question is not, is phi mental or physical? The proper question is, what kind of primitive must exist so that both mental and physical can later be meaningful classifications of pattern? And the answer is a primitive of comparability, the capacity for difference before any category. That is what phi is at this stage of the story. Now let's talk about why humans are so addicted to the split. Because the split is useful. When something is public and persistent, we can build technology, we can build bridges, we can coordinate, we can share measurements, we can do science. When something is private and fluid, we can imagine, we can plan, we can grieve, we can love, we can create meaning, we can adapt. So our language evolved to treat them as different realms, the objective and the subjective, the outer and the inner, the physical and the mental. But usefulness is not the same as fundamentality. A map can be useful without being the ground. A classification can be useful without being the root. Part 16 is earning permission to treat the classification as derived. And this matters operationally, not just philosophically, because the moment you treat the split as fundamental, you build entire sciences on top of a false gap. And then you spend centuries asking why the gap won't close. You look for a bridge molecule, as if mind and matter are two islands and you need a ferry. You hunt for the moment where neural activity becomes experience, as if there is a magical border crossing. You demand a special ingredient, a spark, as if consciousness is a substance that must be poured into matter. HOLOPHASE says, stop. You are trying to solve a problem created by the assumption that the split is primitive. If the split is derived, the right work is different. You don't hunt for a ferry between two islands. You study how one landscape produces two different regions with different rules of stability and access. Now, in holophase language, how do we describe different rules of stability and access without smuggling in full dynamics? We speak carefully. We say, later, in differentiated phi, there will be licensed windows, regions of comparability where patterns can be made public under coherence constraints. Some patterns will be stable enough, coherent enough, and reproducible enough across many windows to be treated as physical. Other patterns will be stable inside one window or inside one organism, but not shareable in the same direct way. They will be treated as mental. But we do not yet build that machinery here. We are still earning permission. So part 16 stays at the level of what must be true in principle for the split to be meaningful at all. And here is the crucial move. To call something mental or physical, you must already have a way to distinguish it from something else. A thought must be distinguishable from another thought, or from silence, or from sensation. A rock must be distinguishable from air, or from another rock, or from your hand. That means comparability is prior. That means phi is prior, which means the mind-matter distinction cannot be primitive, because the ability to make the distinction is already phi. This is almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. Yet it is the kind of simplicity that changes everything, because it pulls the plug on centuries of confused argument. Now, we can sharpen the claim in the most rigorous form that still stays in simple language. The mind-matter split is a split between two pattern classes, not two substances. And we can name the pattern classes in a way that is operational rather than metaphysical. Matter-like patterns are those that tend to be more persistent across time readouts when those readouts later exist, more stable under perturbation, more intersubjectively checkable. Many observers can license the same pattern as there, more compressible into shared rules. The same pattern can be summarized by simple constraints that hold repeatedly. Mind-like patterns are those that tend to be more fleeting and context-sensitive, more private to a particular carrier system, more self-referential, patterns that include a model of their own state, more semantically loaded. They don't just persist, they mean. Notice, none of this required us to say matter is the primitive and mind is the accident, or mind is the primitive and matter is the illusion. We are describing differences of stability, access, and self-reference. Differences that can exist inside one primitive. Now we have to include the operational heart of holophase, prediction and falsification. So let's make a prediction that is concrete enough to matter, but honest enough not to smuggle tomorrow into today. Prediction. If phi is the primitive and the mind-matter split is derived, then any successful scientific account of consciousness will not require a second substance. It will require identifying a class of phi patterns that are self-referential, integrated, and coherence-maintaining in a way that supports reportability and memory. In other words, the signature of consciousness will be pattern structure, not special material. And you should expect this pattern structure to be realizable in more than one physical substrate because it is a pattern class. Like a melody can be played on a flute or on a piano. Like an algorithm can run on different hardware. The carrier can change while the pattern class remains. That does not mean anything can be conscious. It means the criterion will be structural, not mystical. A second prediction follows. If mind and matter are two pattern classes, then the boundary between them will be fuzzy, graded, and context-dependent, because pattern stability and accessibility come in degrees. So you should expect altered states where private patterns become less integrated or more fragmented. brain injuries, where some aspects of consciousness fade while others remain; dreaming, where a private world is generated with high internal vividness but low public stability; hallucination, where private patterns override public constraints; meditative states, where self-reference changes shape. And in all of these, you should not expect a clean switch labeled consciousness on, off. You should expect changing pattern coherence, changing integration, changing self-reference. That is a prediction that can be checked against careful neuroscience and careful phenomenology. Now, falsification. How could part 16 fail? Here is a concrete falsification condition stated plainly. If it becomes necessary, not merely fashionable, not merely convenient, but necessary in principle, to posit two irreducible ontological primitives, one mental and one physical, such that no single pattern language can represent both without contradiction, then this claim fails. Put even more simply, if someone can demonstrate a property of conscious experience that cannot be represented as any kind of pattern in a neutral primitive, then our claim fails. For example, if there exists a reproducible, operationally testable, mind-only effect that cannot be expressed as any pattern relation, any difference structure, any licensed comparison, and cannot be embedded into a unified formalism without adding a second primitive, then the neutral ground thesis collapses. Or if someone can prove, with the same level of rigor we demand in the rest of holophase, that comparability itself must already be mental, such that phi cannot be prior to mind, then this part fails. Those are hard conditions. They are supposed to be, because we are making a deep claim. But the claim is not unfalsifiable. It is a wager about what kind of root language is needed to unify reality without cheating. Now, we also have to state scope and limits, because part 16 can easily be misused. Scope. This claim applies at the level of foundations, what is allowed to be primitive and what must be derived. It does not claim in this part to provide a full theory of consciousness. It does not claim in this part to replace neuroscience. It does not claim in this part to define exactly which patterns correspond to which experiences. Those belong to later work in differentiated phi, where we can speak about licensed windows, coherence measures, persistent encoders, and the public readouts that will later be called omega, kappa, and nu. Omega, kappa, and nu, without smuggling them in. Limits. We are not saying experience is an illusion. Quite the opposite. We are saying experience is real because it is patterned difference. And patterned difference is what reality is made of. We are not saying the external world is an illusion. We are saying the external world is the regime of patterns that remain stable under shared licensing. We are not saying everything is subjective. We are saying subjectivity is a specific pattern property, privacy and self-reference, not a separate realm. Now, an energy reminder, because people love to use energy as a magic word right at the moment they get confused. In holophase, energy is not a substance. Energy is a tally, a bookkeeping measure derived from translation symmetry once differentiated readouts exist. So energy cannot be used here to explain mind or matter, because we are still in undifferentiated phi. If energy appears in your head while listening to this, treat it as a later label. It is not allowed as a primitive ingredient in this part. Now let's return to everyday reality one more time, because the deepest claims only survive if they can be felt in ordinary life. Think about reading. Words on a screen are physical, we say. Pixels, light, glass. Meaning is mental, we say. Understanding, imagination, emotion. But look closely. Meaning is not floating above the pixels. Meaning is not trapped inside a skull either. Meaning is a pattern relationship that can be carried across mediums. The same sentence can be spoken aloud, printed on paper, memorized, translated, whispered, sung. The carrier changes. The pattern relationship persists. You are listening right now, and what is happening is not physical then mental. It is pattern reading pattern. The words in sound become differences in your auditory system, which become differences in your conceptual system, which become differences in your feeling system, and then become differences in your expectations about what reality is. The split is practical, not fundamental. We use it because it helps. But what actually happens is one continuous chain of pattern carriage. Or think about pain. A doctor can measure nerve conduction. That looks physical. You can report suffering. That looks mental. But suffering is not just mental, and nerve conduction is not the whole truth. There are two pattern descriptions of the same event class, one public and one private, one measured by instruments and one measured by lived report. If you treat the split as fundamental, you end up dismissing people. If you treat the split as derived, you end up integrating care. This is why part 16 feels healing. Not because it is sentimental, because it refuses the false hierarchy that has harmed both science and people. Now let's give the listener the simplest, most stable sentence to carry, because if you carry nothing else, carry this. Phi is the common ground from which mind and matter differentiate. That is the memory hook. And now, before we close, we stitch part 16 back into the arc of episode 13, because this episode is not a collection of isolated claims. It is one earned threshold. We began by saying, we do not begin from space or time. We do not begin from matter or energy. We begin from readability itself. We earned that phi is comparability, that it is pre-ontological, that it is possibility, that only relations speak, that relations require carriers, that value space is cyclic, that global consistency may require patches, that the domain is abstract, that phi is smooth where defined, that phi has bottomless descriptive depth, that absolute values are unobservable and only differences speak, that phi has no intrinsic dynamics, that time and space are later readings rather than containers. And now we add, the mind-matter split is also a later reading, a later classification, not the root. So the silent ground is now fully neutral in the deepest sense. Not inside time, not inside space, not inside matter, not inside mind. Before all of these splits. Pure comparability, pure capacity for difference, pure readiness for patterns to become public. That is where we are standing, which means the next step cannot be another permission about what phi is in itself. The next step must be the crossing, how possibilities become a public world, how private differences become shared differences, how coherence becomes licensed, how a universe becomes not merely possible, but communicable. So we end part 16 calmly, without hype. If you have ever felt torn between the inside and the outside, between mind and world, remember this. The split is not the root. The root is the capacity for difference to be readable at all. And in that root, you and the rock share a common ground. Not because you are the same thing, but because you are two pattern families inside one primitive language. Peace be upon you.